The morning sun felt especially warm that day, as Mrs. Beatrice Johnson carefully lowered herself onto her gardening stool. At 78 years old, her joints weren't what they used to be, but nothing could keep her from tending to her roses. Those flowers had been her pride for over 40 years, ever since she and her late husband bought this little blue house on Maple Street. "Just a little more water for you beauties," she murmured, her weathered hands gentle around the watering can. The roses were showing off their best colors today, deep reds and soft pinks that neighbors often stopped to admire. Beatrice had lived in this neighborhood her whole life. She'd raised 3 children here, welcomed 6 grandchildren, and had been a pillar of the community since before most residents were born. Everyone knew Mrs. Johnson, the retired school teacher who still tutored neighborhood kids at her kitchen table and organized the community food drive every Thanksgiving. She hummed softly, an old gospel tune her mother had taught her, when the screech of tires caught her attention. 2 police cruisers had pulled up sharply in front of her house, their arrival so sudden that birds scattered from the nearby oak tree. Beatrice straightened up slowly, one hand pressing against her lower back as she rose. She adjusted her flowered gardening hat and squinted in confusion. 2 officers, both young, both white, stepped out and approached her gate with purposeful strides. Their hands rested near their belts in a way that made Beatrice's heart skip. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the house," the taller officer called out. His name tag read Officer Wilson. His partner, a stockier man with close-cropped hair, flanked him with a stern expression. His tag showed Officer Bennett. "I beg your pardon?" Beatrice asked, setting down her watering can. "Is something wrong, officers?" Officer Wilson's eyes scanned the property as he spoke. "We received a call about suspicious activity at this address. Someone tampering with property." Beatrice almost laughed. "Suspicious activity? I'm watering my roses, young man. I've lived in this house for 43 years. Officer Bennett stepped forward, his tone clipped. "Ma'am, we need to see some identification." "My ID is inside the house," Beatrice said, pointing toward her front door. "I don't generally bring my wallet out to garden in my own yard." The officers exchanged glances. "Ma'am, please keep your hands where we can see them," Officer Wilson said, his voice hardening. Across the street, Beatrice noticed Mrs. Patel stepping onto her porch, watching with concern. A few doors down, Thomas Green had paused while washing his car. "This is ridiculous," Beatrice said, her voice steady despite the tremble starting in her hands. "I'm telling you, I live here. Ask anyone on this street." "We have a report of an intruder matching your description," Officer Bennett insisted. "Matching my description?" Beatrice echoed, disbelief washing over her. "An elderly woman gardening in broad daylight?" "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back," Officer Wilson instructed, pulling handcuffs from his belt, young man. "I most certainly will not," Beatrice replied, drawing herself up to her full height of 5 feet, 3 inches. "This is my home. I've lived here since before you were born." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Officer Bennett gripped her arm, spinning her around with more force than necessary. The watering can clattered to the ground, splashing water across her carefully tended flower bed. Before she could process what was happening, cold metal closed around her wrists. "You're making a terrible mistake," Beatrice said, her voice wavering now. "Please, my blood pressure medication is inside. I need to take it at noon." Neither officer responded as they led her toward the police car. Beatrice felt dozens of eyes on her. Neighbors emerging from homes, a mail carrier frozen in place on his route, children on bicycles stopping to stare. The shame burned hotter than the summer sun. "Mrs. Johnson, what are they doing?" Thomas called out, dropping his sponge and hurrying toward them. "Sir, please stay back," Officer Wilson warned, holding up his hand. "This is crazy." "That's Mrs. Johnson. She's lived here forever," Thomas protested, keeping his distance but raising his voice so others could hear. Mrs. Patel had her phone out now, apparently recording the scene. More neighbors were gathering, their faces showing mixtures of shock and outrage. "Call my grandson," Beatrice called to Mrs. Patel. "His number is by my phone." Officer Bennett helped Beatrice into the back seat of the cruiser, her arthritic knees making the process painful and awkward. The door slammed shut, sealing her inside. Through the window, she could see her neighbors gesturing animatedly, some on phones, others approaching the second officer. As the car pulled away from the curb, Beatrice caught a final glimpse of her house, her sanctuary for over 4 decades, and the roses she wouldn't finish watering today. The ride to the station passed in a blur. Beatrice sat quietly, her wrist throbbing where the handcuffs bit into her skin. She'd lived through the civil rights era, had seen water fountains labeled colored and white, had been denied service at lunch counters. But somehow, being handcuffed in her own garden at her age struck a different kind of pain, one that made her wonder how much had really changed. At the station, they led her to a bench in a processing area. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows, making everyone look sickly. Young people, most younger than her grandchildren, sat on similar benches around the room, some defiant, others defeated. "Name?" asked a desk officer without looking up. "Beatrice Johnson," she replied, her voice soft but dignified. "And I would like to know why I've been brought here when I've done nothing wrong." The officer finally looked up, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of the elderly woman before him. "Address: 1423 Maple Street. The same address I've had for 43 years. The house with the blue shutters and the rose garden that just won the Neighborhood Beautification Award last month." A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He turned to Officer Wilson, who was filling out paperwork nearby. "This is the suspicious person from the Oakwood call?" the desk officer asked. Officer Wilson nodded without looking up. "Matched the description. Refused to provide ID. Resisted compliance. Because I was gardening at my own home," Beatrice said, her voice rising slightly. "My ID was inside the house. I wasn't carrying my purse to pull weeds in my own yard." The desk officer frowned, typing something into his computer. After a moment, he leaned closer to the screen. "The call was about 1423 Oak Street," he said slowly. "Not Maple." Officer Wilson looked up sharply. "What?" "The dispatcher report says Oak Street," the desk officer repeated. "This is Maple Street." A heavy silence fell. Officer Bennett, who had been standing nearby, approached the desk and looked at the screen. "Check the call record," he said quietly. The desk officer tapped a few more keys, then sighed. "Dispatch definitely said Oak Street. It's right here in the transcript." Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. After a moment, she opened them and fixed all three men with a steady gaze. "Would someone please remove these handcuffs and call my grandson? His name is David Johnson. He's a law student at State University." The room seemed to hold its breath. Then Officer Wilson moved forward, keys in hand, and gently removed the handcuffs. Red marks circled Beatrice's wrists where they had dug into her skin. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his face flushed. "There's been a misunderstanding." "No," Beatrice corrected him, rubbing her wrists. "There's been a mistake. A very serious one." Outside the station window, she could see more squad cars arriving. The afternoon was wearing on, and she wondered if her roses would wilt in the heat without their afternoon watering. "We'll drive you back home right away," Officer Bennett offered. Beatrice shook her head. "I believe I'll wait for my grandson." Her voice was calm, but something in her eyes made all three officers look away. Already her mind was racing ahead. This wasn't just about her or a mix-up of street names. This was about something bigger, something that needed to change. As she sat on the hard bench waiting for David to arrive, Beatrice Johnson made a decision. This mistake, painful as it was, would not be wasted. She had taught generations of children in this town. She had lived through history that these young officers had only read about in books, and now perhaps she had one more lesson to teach. David Johnson burst through the police station doors with the force of a summer storm. At 26, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew his rights and wasn't afraid to assert them. His law textbooks remained scattered across his apartment table, where he'd abandoned them after Mrs. Patel's frantic call. "I'm here for my grandmother." "Beatrice Johnson," he announced to the front desk, his voice controlled despite the anger simmering beneath. "She was wrongfully arrested from her own property this morning." The desk sergeant looked up, recognition and discomfort crossing his face. "Yes, sir. We were just about to process her release. There was a misunderstanding about—" "A misunderstanding?" David cut in. "You handcuffed a 78-year-old woman in her own garden and dragged her down to the station. That's not a misunderstanding. That's negligence at best." Heads turned throughout the station. David spotted his grandmother sitting on a bench, back straight as always, hands folded in her lap. Despite her composed appearance, he noticed the redness around her wrists and the tired slump of her shoulders. "Grandma," he said, his voice softening as he crossed the room. "Are you okay?" Beatrice looked up, relief washing over her face. David, thank goodness. As David helped his grandmother to her feet, Officer Wilson approached, paperwork in hand. Mrs. Johnson, we sincerely apologize for the confusion. If you'll just sign these release forms. Release forms? David's eyebrows shot up. She was never formally arrested. You detained her unlawfully based on incorrect information that could have been verified with a simple check. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably. It's standard procedure, sir. So is verifying an address before handcuffing a senior citizen, David replied. My grandmother will not be signing anything without legal review. We'll be filing a formal complaint. Beatrice placed a gentle hand on her grandson's arm. David, I just want to go home to my roses. We'll go home, Grandma, he assured her. But this isn't over. As they left the station, David noticed a small crowd gathered outside. Mrs. Patel was there, along with Thomas Green and at least a dozen other neighbors. Someone had brought Beatrice's medication and a bottle of water. Mrs. Johnson, called Lisa Chen, who ran the local bakery. We've been so worried. Are you all right? Asked Mr. Washington, the retired postal worker who'd lived across from Beatrice for 30 years. The neighborhood had rallied, their concern palpable. And in the back of the crowd, David spotted something that made his breath catch. A young woman with a press badge, notebook in hand. Ms. Johnson, she called out, stepping forward. I'm Olivia Torres from the Herald. Would you be willing to comment on what happened today? Before David could intervene, Beatrice straightened her back. Young lady, today I was handcuffed in my own garden for the crime of watering my roses while being black in a neighborhood I've called home for over 40 years. If that isn't a story worth telling, I don't know what is. The words hung in the air, powerful in their simplicity and truth. By evening, Beatrice's roses had been watered, not by her, but by neighbors who'd taken turns tending her garden while she rested inside. David sat at her kitchen table, phone pressed to his ear, legal pad filled with notes. Yes, Professor Taylor, he said. It's exactly the kind of case we discussed in Civil Liberties last semester. Yes, I understand the sensitivity. Of course, my grandmother's well-being comes first. Beatrice watched her grandson from her armchair, a cup of chamomile tea cooling in her hands. She felt tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. Yet watching David, so passionate, so determined, filled her with a familiar warmth. You remind me of your grandfather, she said after he hung up. He never could stand by when he saw something wrong. David looked up, his expression softening. Grandma, Professor Taylor wants to help. This isn't just about what happened to you. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Beatrice nodded slowly. I know, child. Why do you think I spoke to that reporter? The next morning, Beatrice's face was on the front page of the local Herald. Respected elder wrongfully arrested in her own garden, the headline read. The article detailed the incident, including quotes from neighbors who'd witnessed it. By noon, larger news outlets had picked up the story. Beatrice's phone rang constantly. David had taken the day off from classes to screen calls and visitors. Community leaders, civil rights organizations, and even the mayor's office had reached out. Mrs. Johnson, said Pastor Williams when he visited that afternoon, the congregation wants you to know we stand with you. This Sunday's service will address what happened, if you're comfortable with that. Tell them I'll be there myself, Beatrice replied. Front row, same as always. Meanwhile, across town, the police department issued a statement. Chief Reynolds expressed regret for the unfortunate incident and promised a thorough review of dispatch protocols. The carefully worded press release mentioned improved training, but stopped short of acknowledging any broader issues. By day 3, the story had taken on a life of its own. Local television showed footage of Beatrice's garden, her roses still blooming despite the disturbance. Social media buzzed with the hashtag #MonorRespectOurElders, alongside photos of Beatrice from community events over the years, reading to children at the library, organizing food drives, receiving a community service award from the previous mayor. This isn't what I wanted, Beatrice sighed, turning away from the television where her story played yet again. What did you want, Grandma? David asked gently. She looked at him, her eyes clear and determined. Change, child. Real change. Not 15 minutes of fame. That evening, a candlelight vigil formed outside the police station. What began as a few dozen people swelled to hundreds as the night progressed. They carried signs with Beatrice's yearbook photo from her teaching days, alongside messages like, Would you handcuff your grandmother? And protect our elders, not arrest them. David stood at the edge of the crowd, watching in amazement as people of all ages and backgrounds joined together. He spotted his law school classmates mingling with Beatrice's church friends and neighborhood families. Officer Wilson watched the proceedings from inside the station, his expression unreadable. Next to him, Officer Bennett shifted uncomfortably. "It's getting bigger," Bennett said quietly. Wilson nodded. "My mom called me today. Asked me if I was the officer in the paper." He paused. She was disappointed. The police department's internal investigation moved slowly, but public pressure mounted daily. When Chief Reynolds announced a community forum to address concerns, the high school auditorium had to be secured to accommodate the expected turnout. 5 days after the incident, Beatrice sat at her kitchen table reviewing the statement she planned to deliver at the forum. David had helped her organize her thoughts, but the words were entirely her own. "Are you sure you're up for this, Grandma?" David asked, noticing how she rubbed her wrists where the handcuff marks had finally faded. "No one would blame you if you wanted to stay home." Beatrice looked up at her grandson, a spark in her eyes that he recognized from childhood, the same look she'd had when standing up to the school board over budget cuts, or confronting the city council about neglected street repairs in their neighborhood. "David," she said firmly, "I spent my youth watching people march for the right to be treated as human beings. I spent my career teaching children that their voices matter. If I stay silent now, what was it all for?" A knock at the door interrupted them. David opened it to find Thomas Green standing on the porch holding a large manila envelope. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, stepping inside, "I thought you should see this before tonight." He pulled out several sheets of paper, printouts of similar incidents across the county. Names, dates, and circumstances all carefully documented. "I work in data analysis," Thomas explained. "After what happened to you, I started digging. These are just from the past 2 years. Beatrice studied the papers, her expression grave. "Thank you, Thomas. This changes my speech considerably." That evening, as Beatrice prepared to leave for the forum, she paused by her roses. They stood tall and vibrant in the evening light, unbothered by the human drama that had unfolded around them. "You know," she said to David as he helped her into the car, "those officers made a mistake when they put handcuffs on these old wrists." "What's that?" David asked. Beatrice's eyes gleamed with purpose. "They thought they were silencing an old woman. Instead, they gave her the loudest voice she's had in years." As they drove toward the high school, neither grandmother nor grandson could have predicted how that voice would echo in the days to come, or how it would ultimately transform their community in ways both painful and necessary. The high school auditorium buzzed with voices as people filled every seat. The community forum had been scheduled to start 10 minutes ago, but the line of residents waiting to enter still stretched into the parking lot. Police Chief Reynolds paced behind the stage, checking his watch repeatedly. "We need to begin, sir," an aide suggested, eyeing the restless crowd. "Not until everyone's seated," the chief replied, tugging at his collar. 27 years on the force hadn't prepared him for this kind of spotlight. In the front row, Beatrice Johnson sat with perfect posture, her hands folded over the manila envelope in her lap. David sat beside her, occasionally leaning in to whisper reassurances. On her other side, Pastor Williams offered silent support. Near the back of the auditorium, Officers Wilson and Bennett slipped in through a side door. They weren't in uniform. The chief had suggested plain clothes would be less inflammatory, but people recognized them anyway. Conversations hushed as they passed. Faces turned to watch them find seats. Officer Wilson felt the weight of every stare. He'd spent the past 5 days replaying the incident in his mind. The dispatch call, the street name, the quick assumptions, the handcuffs. Each memory made his stomach twist. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," he whispered to Bennett. Bennett shook his head. "Chief says we need to face this head on." Wilson wasn't convinced. His phone vibrated with another text from his mother. "Doing the right thing isn't always easy. Proud of you for showing up." Finally, Chief Reynolds took the stage. Feedback squealed as he adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he began, his voice steady despite his obvious discomfort. "The purpose of this forum is to address concerns arising from an incident last week involving Mrs. Beatrice Johnson." A ripple of murmurs swept through the crowd. "The department has launched a full internal investigation which is ongoing. However, I want to acknowledge immediately that mistakes were made." Mrs. Johnson should never have been handcuffed or taken to the station. For that, the department sincerely apologizes. The chief's words fell flat in the cavernous space. From the front row, Beatrice's expression remained unchanged. "We've invited Mrs. Johnson to speak tonight," he continued, "along with anyone else from the community who wishes to share their perspective. Our goal is to listen, learn, and work together toward better practices." As Beatrice rose to approach the stage, the audience erupted in applause. She moved slowly but deliberately, her head high. David watched with a mixture of pride and concern as she took the microphone. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear and strong despite her years. "I taught in this school district for 38 years. In that time, I stood on this very stage for graduation speeches, award ceremonies, and retirement parties. I never imagined I'd be here under these circumstances." The room fell completely silent. What happened to me last week was not just a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was the result of assumptions, dangerous ones, about who belongs where and who deserves the benefit of the doubt. She opened the manila envelope and removed Thomas's documents. "These papers contain details of 23 similar incidents in our county over the past 2 years. 23 times when someone was detained, questioned, or arrested for doing ordinary things in places they had every right to be. The common thread? They all looked like me." Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling Bennett tense beside him. "I don't believe Officers Wilson and Bennett woke up that morning planning to handcuff a grandmother in her garden," Beatrice continued. "But I do believe they made split-second judgments based on what they saw. An old black woman who didn't fit their idea of who should be in that neighborhood, despite the fact I've lived there longer than they've been alive." Beatrice paused, her gaze sweeping across the room until it settled on the 2 officers in the back. "I see you're here tonight. That's a start. But showing up isn't enough. Real change requires honest reflection and hard work." For the next hour, community members lined up to speak. A college student described being followed through stores by security guards. A businessman told of being pulled over 3 times in 1 month, never receiving a ticket. A teenage boy explained how he'd been questioned for sitting in his own front yard. Each story built upon the last, painting a picture of daily indignities and constant vigilance that many in the room had never had to consider. Wilson felt a strange hollowness in his chest as he listened. These weren't criminals with grievances. They were ordinary people, teachers, nurses, mechanics, students, all describing versions of the same experience. After the last speaker, Chief Reynolds returned to the microphone, visibly shaken. "I thank you all for your honesty tonight," he said. "It's clear we have serious work to do. I'm announcing several immediate actions: a comprehensive review of our dispatch and detention protocols, implicit bias training for all officers, and the formation of a community oversight committee to ensure accountability." As the forum concluded, people lingered in small groups, continuing conversations that felt too important to end. Wilson stood against the back wall, uncertain what to do next. "Officer Wilson." He turned to find David Johnson standing before him, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Johnson," Wilson acknowledged, bracing himself. "My grandmother would like to speak with you," David said. "Both of you," he added, glancing at Bennett. "Tomorrow afternoon. Her house. 3 o'clock." Before Wilson could respond, David handed him a card with an address he already knew by heart. The next day, Wilson sat in his car outside 1423 Maple Street for 20 minutes before finding the courage to approach the house. The blue shutters and perfectly tended rose garden seemed to mock him. Bennett pulled up beside him, looking equally uncomfortable. "You ready for this?" Bennett asked. Wilson shook his head. "Not even a little bit." They walked the path to the front door together, past the spot where they'd handcuffed Beatrice 6 days earlier. David answered their knock, his expression neutral as he led them to the living room. Beatrice sat in an armchair, a photo album open on her lap. She didn't rise when they entered, but gestured to the couch across from her. "Mrs. Johnson," Wilson began, his rehearsed apology evaporating as he met her steady gaze. I was born in 1945, Beatrice interrupted, tapping a black and white photo in her album. "This was my elementary school. We had second-hand books, broken desks, and no heating in winter. The white school across town had everything new." She turned the page, revealing a teenage girl in a graduation cap. "When I became a teacher, I promised myself my students would never feel less than." For 38 years I kept that promise. She looked up at them. Do you know why I became a teacher, Officer Wilson? He shook his head, confused by the direction of the conversation. Because teachers shape how young people see the world and their place in it. She closed the album, much like police officers do. Bennett shifted on the couch. Mrs. Johnson, we're truly sorry for what happened. It was a mistake. Let me finish, she said firmly. I didn't invite you here for a simple apology. I invited you because I want to understand something. When you saw me in my garden, what did you see first? An elderly woman with arthritic hands? A homeowner tending her property? Or did you see my skin color before you saw anything else? The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Wilson opened his mouth and closed it. The truth sat heavy on his tongue. I saw a suspect, he finally admitted. The dispatch said suspicious activity and I just assumed. Beatrice nodded slowly. At least you're honest. That's where we have to start. For the next 2 hours, Beatrice shared stories from her life. Growing up during segregation, marching for civil rights in her youth, raising children who had to learn special rules for interacting with police. She showed them family photos and newspaper clippings she'd saved, painting a picture of a life shaped by both struggle and determination. As the conversation continued, something shifted in the room. The defensive wall Wilson had built around himself began to crumble. These weren't accusations to deflect. They were lived experiences he couldn't deny. My grandmother passed away last year, Bennett said suddenly, looking at a photo of Beatrice with her late husband. She raised me after my parents split. Every time I think about what happened, I imagine someone putting handcuffs on her and I feel sick. Beatrice studied him. Hold on to that feeling, Officer Bennett. That's called empathy. It's the beginning of change. As they prepared to leave, Wilson turned at the door. Mrs. Johnson, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that I hear you, really hear you, and I won't forget this conversation. Beatrice smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. I'm not interested in your guilt, Officer Wilson. I'm interested in your growth. Come back next week. Bring the training manual they gave you at the academy. We have work to do. Walking back to their cars, neither officer spoke immediately. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street, the same street they'd driven down with Beatrice in handcuffs. You coming back next week? Bennett finally asked. Wilson looked back at the little blue house with its immaculate rose garden. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I need to. Officer Wilson sat on Beatrice's porch, flipping through his police academy training manual. 2 weeks had passed since his first visit to her home. This was now his third Wednesday afternoon spent in the same wicker chair, a glass of sweet tea sweating on the table beside him. Page 94, Beatrice instructed from her rocking chair, the section on reasonable suspicion. Wilson found the page and read aloud. Officers may briefly detain an individual for questioning if they have reasonable suspicion that the person has been, is or is about to be engaged in criminal activity. And what constitutes reasonable suspicion, according to your training? Beatrice asked, her knitting needles clicking steadily in her lap. She'd started a new blanket the day after the forum, working her frustration into each stitch. Specific facts, behaviors, or circumstances that would lead a reasonable officer to believe criminal activity is occurring, Wilson recited. Beatrice set her knitting down. Like watering roses? Wilson closed the manual. No, ma'am. That's where we went wrong. There was nothing suspicious about what you were doing. Yet you and Officer Bennett made an assumption, she pressed. I'd like to understand why. The question wasn't new. Each week, Beatrice approached the same issues from different angles, pushing Wilson to dig deeper than his prepared apologies. The dispatcher said suspicious activity. Wilson explained for perhaps the 10th time, but that doesn't excuse what happened next. We should have assessed the situation ourselves instead of going in with preconceived notions. Preconceived notions, Beatrice repeated. That's a polite way of saying it. Wilson rubbed his face. Mrs. Johnson, if you're waiting for me to say it was racial profiling, I'm waiting for you to be honest with yourself, she interrupted. Not for my benefit. For yours. The screen door creaked as David stepped onto the porch with a fresh pitcher of tea. He'd been surprised when his grandmother continued these meetings after the first uncomfortable visit. Even more surprised when Officer Wilson had actually returned, first alone, then occasionally with Bennett. Any progress? David asked, refilling their glasses. Wilson shifted in his chair. Your grandmother doesn't make things easy. Never has, David agreed with a small smile. That's why she was the best teacher in the district. Never accepted less than your best effort. Beatrice adjusted her glasses. Speaking of effort, how was your meeting with Chief Reynolds, David? David had been appointed to the newly formed Community Oversight Committee, along with Pastor Williams and several other respected community members. Their first few meetings had been tense, challenging, David admitted. The chief wants to implement changes, but there's resistance from the old guard. They see oversight as an attack rather than an opportunity for improvement. Wilson nodded. Lieutenant Parker has been vocal about it at the station. Keeps saying we're being thrown under the bus for political reasons. And what do you think? Beatrice asked, her eyes sharp. Wilson hesitated. A month ago I might have agreed with him. Now, I'm not so sure. The conversation was interrupted by a police cruiser pulling up to the curb. Officer Bennett stepped out, followed by another officer, a woman with short gray hair and a no-nonsense expression. Mrs. Johnson, Bennett called as they approached the porch. Hope you don't mind, but I brought someone who wanted to meet you. This is Sergeant Diane Cooper. She runs our training division. Beatrice welcomed them with cool politeness. What brings you to my porch, Sergeant? Cooper took off her hat, revealing more fully the streaks of silver in her dark hair. Honestly, Mrs. Johnson, curiosity. These two have been spending their off-duty hours here for weeks. I wanted to see what was so compelling. Just conversation, Beatrice replied. And some hard truths. Cooper nodded slowly. I've been reviewing our training protocols since the incident. They're outdated at best. They're dangerous, David corrected. They create situations where officers default to seeing threats instead of people. Instead of bristling at the criticism, Cooper pulled a notebook from her pocket. That's why I'm here. I need specifics if I'm going to overhaul our program. For the next hour, Beatrice's porch became an unlikely classroom. David outlined legal concerns with current protocols, while Wilson and Bennett shared their evolving perspectives. Throughout it all, Beatrice guided the conversation with the skill of a teacher who had managed thousands of classroom discussions. As the afternoon light began to fade, Cooper closed her notebook. Mrs. Johnson, would you consider coming to speak to our cadets? They need to hear this directly. Beatrice looked surprised. You want me to address your officers? New recruits first, Cooper clarified. Then we'll work on the veterans. Change has to start somewhere. After the officers left, David sat beside his grandmother in the growing twilight. What do you think? He asked. Beatrice rocked slowly. I think Officer Wilson has been talking to his colleagues. That's a start. Are you going to accept Cooper's invitation? Beatrice picked up her knitting again. I spent my life in classrooms, David. I never turned down a teaching opportunity. The following Monday, Beatrice found herself standing before 20 police cadets in a fluorescent-lit training room. The young faces before her, some eager, some skeptical, all attentive, reminded her of her first day teaching each year. My name is Beatrice Johnson, she began. 3 weeks ago, I was handcuffed in my garden and taken to jail for watering my roses. For the next hour, she shared her experience, then opened the floor for questions. They came hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness. But how do we know when we're making assumptions? Asked a young cadet in the back row. You start by asking yourself a simple question, Beatrice replied. Would I be responding this way if this person looked different? Be honest with the answer, even if it's uncomfortable. Wilson stood at the back of the room watching the cadets engage with Beatrice's wisdom. Something had shifted in him these past weeks. The defensiveness that had been his first reaction had given way to something else, a willingness to listen, to question, to learn. After the session, Sergeant Cooper approached Beatrice with a proposition, a series of community dialogues where officers and residents could share perspectives in a structured environment. The first was scheduled for the following month at the community center. Meanwhile, Officer Wilson found himself with an unexpected assignment. Chief Reynolds had appointed him to work with David on revising the department's community engagement protocols. Why me? Wilson had asked when the chief informed him. Because you've shown you're willing to do the work, Reynolds replied simply, and Mrs. Johnson apparently spoke highly of your progress. That evening, Wilson drove to Maple Street, determined to thank Beatrice for her unexpected endorsement. As he pulled up, he noticed her on her knees in the garden, struggling to reach a weed growing between her prized roses. Without thinking, he parked and walked over. "Need some help with that, Mrs. Johnson?" Beatrice looked up, shielding her eyes from the setting sun. "Officer Wilson. Come to continue our education?" "Actually, I thought maybe I could help with the garden while we talk," he offered. "My mother always said I had a decent green thumb." Beatrice considered him for a moment, then handed him her trowel. "The weeds need pulling, and those roses at the end need pruning. I'll supervise." For the next hour, Wilson worked under Beatrice's watchful eye, learning the difference between morning glory, a weed in disguise, she explained, and her prized climbing roses. As they worked, their conversation flowed more naturally than it had on the porch. "Chief put me on the protocol revision team with your grandson," Wilson mentioned as he carefully cut back a thorny branch. "David told me." Beatrice nodded. He was surprised. "Not as surprised as I was," Wilson admitted. "I'm not sure I deserve that kind of responsibility." Beatrice adjusted her gardening hat. "It's not about deserving, Officer Wilson. It's about being willing to do what's necessary." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Wilson found himself sharing things he hadn't planned to discuss. His childhood in a struggling rural community, his father's emphasis on respect for authority, his own discomfort with the way some fellow officers talked about certain neighborhoods. "Why did you become a police officer?" Beatrice asked, the question so simple yet so fundamental. Wilson paused, pruning shears in hand. "I wanted to help people. To make a difference," he shook his head. "Sounds naive now." "Not naive," Beatrice corrected. "Just incomplete. You can't help people if you don't understand them. And you can't understand them if you see them as abstractions instead of individuals." As Wilson prepared to leave, garden tools cleaned and put away, he turned to Beatrice with unexpected emotion in his voice. "Mrs. Johnson, I've been wanting to ask, can you forgive what happened?" Beatrice studied him thoughtfully. "Forgiveness isn't a single moment, Officer Wilson. It's a process. We're in that process now." She looked out at her garden where the roses stood tall and healthy after his careful attention. "But this is a good start," she added softly. "A very good start." Driving home, Wilson took the long route, passing the community center where the dialogues would soon be held, the police station where protocols were being rewritten, and finally, the intersection of Oak and Maple Streets, where a single miscommunication had set in motion changes none of them could have imagined. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "Meeting tomorrow at 9, bringing coffee. Ready to get to work?" Wilson typed his reply without hesitation. "Ready." 6 months later, Beatrice stood on the steps of City Hall, a large pair of ceremonial scissors in her hands. The crowd before her, a mix of community members, police officers, reporters, and city officials, applauded as she prepared to cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance of the building next door. "The Beatrice Johnson Community Bridge Center," Mayor Powell announced, gesturing to the newly renovated storefront. "A place where officers and citizens can come together to build understanding, resolve conflicts, and strengthen our community." Beatrice smiled, though she still felt strange seeing her name on the building. That hadn't been her idea. When the city council approached her about naming the center, she'd tried to suggest alternatives. People who had done more, fought harder, sacrificed more than she had. But David had convinced her to accept. "Some stories capture people's attention in ways others don't," he'd explained. "Your story did that, Grandma. It opened doors that were closed before." Now, as she prepared to cut the ribbon, Beatrice looked for familiar faces in the crowd. David stood near the front, beaming with pride. Behind him, she spotted Officer Wilson in his dress uniform, standing alongside Officer Bennett and Sergeant Cooper. "Before we officially open this center," Beatrice said, her voice amplified by the microphone, "I want to remind everyone why we're here. 6 months ago, a mistake was made. I was handcuffed in my own garden for the crime of watering my roses." A hush fell over the crowd. That could have been the end of the story. A complaint filed. An apology issued. Everyone moving on until the next incident, the next mistake. Instead, something different happened. She looked directly at Officer Wilson. People chose to listen, to learn, to change. Beatrice shifted her gaze to the crowd. This center represents that choice. It's not just a building. It's a commitment to doing the hard work of understanding each other, even when, especially when, it's uncomfortable. With that, she cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted as people began filing into the center for the open house. Inside, the space had been transformed from an abandoned retail store into something warm and inviting. One room had been set up for community dialogues, with chairs arranged in a circle. Another contained desks where officers would hold regular office hours, available to address concerns outside the intimidating environment of the police station. A third space was dedicated to youth programs, designed to build positive relationships between young people and law enforcement. Beatrice made her way through the rooms, stopping to chat with visitors. She found Officer Wilson in the youth space, explaining the new mentorship program to a group of interested parents. "We'll have officers volunteering as tutors and activity leaders," he was saying. "The idea is to create relationships based on support rather than enforcement." "Officer Wilson makes an excellent math tutor," Beatrice interjected. "He's been helping my great-grandson with algebra every Thursday afternoon." Wilson smiled, a hint of embarrassment coloring his face. "Mrs. Johnson gives me too much credit. Tyler's a natural with numbers." After the open house wound down, a smaller group gathered at Beatrice's home for a celebration. Her garden was in full bloom, the roses more magnificent than ever. Fairy lights strung across the yard twinkled as the sun began to set. David manned the grill while neighbors brought covered dishes and desserts. Chief Reynolds arrived in casual clothes, looking more relaxed than anyone had seen him in months. Sergeant Cooper brought her wife, who turned out to be an avid gardener herself, and the two women soon disappeared among the rose bushes, deep in conversation about fertilizers and pruning techniques. Officer Bennett chased toddlers across the lawn in an impromptu game of tag, while Officer Wilson sat on the porch steps, nursing a lemonade and watching the scene with a thoughtful expression. "Penny for your thoughts," Beatrice said, lowering herself carefully to sit beside him. "Just thinking about how different things could have been," Wilson replied. "If you'd been someone else. If you hadn't spoken up. If the community hadn't rallied around you." Beatrice nodded. "That's why the work isn't finished. Not everyone has a neighborhood willing to stand with them. Not everyone has a grandson who knows the law. Not everyone has a voice that people will listen to. But more people are listening now," Wilson pointed out. "The department has changed. We've revised protocols, implemented new training, established community oversight." "Progress," Beatrice agreed. "Not perfection, but progress." Across the yard, David clinked a spoon against his glass, calling for everyone's attention. "I have an announcement," he said when the chatter died down. "As some of you know, I've been finishing up law school while working on the Community Oversight Committee. What you don't know is that I've accepted a position with the district attorney's office." Surprised murmurs rippled through the gathering. "I'll be working in a newly created division focused on reviewing cases of potential misconduct and wrongful arrests," David continued. "The DA created the position after what happened to my grandmother. Sometimes it takes a spark to light a fire." Cheers and applause followed. Beatrice felt tears prick at her eyes as pride swelled in her chest. Later, as guests began to leave, Chief Reynolds approached Beatrice with an envelope in hand. "This came through today," he said, handing it to her. "I wanted to deliver it personally." Inside was an official document, the city's settlement for her wrongful arrest. The figure was substantial, not life-changing for Beatrice herself, but enough to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in community advocacy or criminal justice reform. "The money matters less than the acknowledgement," Beatrice told the chief. "Though I can think of good uses for it." "I'm sure you can, Mrs. Johnson," he replied with a knowing smile. As twilight deepened into evening, only a few guests remained. Officer Wilson helped David clear the last of the plates while Beatrice sat in her garden chair, watching fireflies begin their nightly dance above her roses. Officer Bennett approached, his young daughter half asleep against his shoulder. "Mrs. Johnson," he said softly, "I wanted to thank you before we head home, not just for today but for everything these past months. You could have just sued the department and been done with us." "What would that have accomplished?" Beatrice asked. "Another settlement, another news cycle, and nothing really changes." Bennett nodded. "My daughter starts kindergarten next year. Because of what you've done, what we've all done together, she'll grow up in a community that's at least trying to do better. That matters." After the last guest departed, David found his grandmother still sitting in the garden, gazing at her roses in the moonlight. "Quite a day," he said, pulling up a chair beside her. Quite a 6 months, she corrected. Your grandfather would be proud of you, David. Taking that position with the DA. David smiled. He'd be even prouder of you, Grandma. You turned a terrible experience into something meaningful. Beatrice reached out to touch a particularly beautiful bloom. You know what I've learned from my roses over the years? Sometimes it takes a harsh pruning to encourage new growth. The next morning, Beatrice woke early, as was her habit. She made her tea and shuffled out to check on her garden while the dew still clung to the grass. To her surprise, a police cruiser was parked at the curb. For a brief moment, old anxiety fluttered in her chest. But it quickly faded when Officer Wilson emerged, carrying gardening gloves and a small potted plant. Mrs. Johnson, he called, approaching the fence. Hope I'm not too early. I brought you something. Beatrice opened the gate, curious. What's this? A peace rose, Wilson explained, holding up the small bush with yellow blooms edged in pink. The nursery owner said they symbolize new beginnings. Thought it might find a good home in your garden. Beatrice studied the young officer's face. No longer a stranger, not quite a friend, but something important nonetheless. A reminder that change was possible, that growth could come from the most unlikely circumstances. I know just where to plant it, she said, leading him to an empty spot at the center of her garden, right here where everyone can see it. Together, they knelt in the soft earth, the retired teacher and the police officer digging a hole for the peace rose. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the garden, neighbors walking their dogs or collecting their morning papers paused to wave. Some even crossed the street to ask about the new addition to Beatrice's famous rose garden. It's a special one, she told each person who asked. It reminds us that even the biggest mistakes can lead to something beautiful, if we're willing to do the work of tending it together.